December 7, 1941. 7:55 a.m. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy sank or damaged 19 American ships, destroyed nearly 350 aircraft, and killed more than 400 Americans, for the loss of 29 planes. It was, by every conventional measure of naval warfare, one of the most complete tactical victories in modern military history. Within 6 months, Japan would control a stretch of the Pacific and Southeast Asia larger than the continental United States. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, all falling in rapid succession. To the rest of the world watching in the winter of 1941 and into the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy looked unstoppable. But the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack never actually believed that story. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, had lived in the United States. He'd studied at Harvard between 1919 and 1921 and later served as a naval attaché in Washington. He'd toured American oil fields, automobile plants, and steel mills, and he understood something most of his own government refused to accept: that Japan could not outproduce the United States in a long war, only outfight it in a short one. In private correspondence before the war began, Yamamoto wrote a line that would prove almost eerily precise: that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but that beyond that, he had utterly no confidence in the outcome. He wasn't being modest. He was doing math most of his own admirals refused to do. This is a story about how close he came to being right, and about the specific, unglamorous, windowless basement in Hawaii, where a small group of American Navy officers made sure he wasn't. Before we go further, I want to say something, because I think it matters for a story like this one. These aren't just dates and code names. This is family history for a lot of people watching. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. Whether it was a codebreaker, a sailor, a pilot, or someone who never talked about it much. I'd genuinely like to know. Now, back to that basement 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, in a cramped, windowless room beneath the old administration building at the Pearl Harbor Naval Station. A space cryptanalysts nicknamed the Dungeon, lit by fluorescent lights that never turned off because the work never stopped. A 41-year-old Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort was trying to break the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational code, a system the Americans had labeled JN-25. Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. He'd enlisted in the Navy at 17 in 1918, never finished a formal college degree, and had spent 3 years living in Japan in the late 1920s and early 1930s, studying the language until he thought in it. He worked in a smoking jacket instead of a uniform, slept on a cot a few feet from his desk, and ran his unit, officially the Combat Intelligence Unit, more commonly called Station Hippo, on almost no sleep and constant coffee. His team, roughly 24 officers, linguists, and mathematicians, spent early 1942 doing something that had no glamour to it at all: staring at strings of 5-digit number groups, trying to find the seams in a code system built around roughly 45,000 possible values, each one further scrambled by a separate layer of random numbers called an additive. By April 1942, 4 months into the effort, Rochefort's team could reliably read only 10 to 15% of any given JN-25 message. That doesn't sound like much. It was, in practice, enough, because the 10 to 15% they could read tended to be the words that mattered most: ship names, place designators, dates, force compositions, the skeleton of a battle plan, even when the connecting tissue stayed encrypted. And in early May 1942, that skeleton started spelling out something specific. Japanese naval traffic kept referencing an operation aimed at a location the Americans had never been able to identify, tagged in the intercepts only by a 2-letter designator: AF. Rochefort had a hunch about what AF stood for. His superiors in Washington, reading the same fragments, disagreed, and the argument between them, over a tiny atoll most Americans had never heard of, was about to decide the entire war in the Pacific. Mid-May 1942. Station Hype, Pearl Harbor. The argument over AF had become more than academic. In Washington, the Office of Naval Intelligence believed the Japanese were massing for an attack on the west coast of the United States, or possibly Hawaii itself, correctly. Rochefort's team in Hawaii believed something narrower and on paper less dramatic, that AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, and that the Japanese intended to seize it as a forward base and, more importantly, use the threat against it to lure the crippled American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle Japan expected to win. It was Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, a member of Rochefort's team, who came up with the idea to settle the argument. If Midway itself sent a message, not encrypted, deliberately sent in the clear over an unsecured channel, reporting a specific, plausible logistical problem, and Japanese signals intelligence picked it up and repeated the same detail back in their own coded traffic, there would be no more room for doubt. On May 19, 1942, the Midway garrison, at Rochefort's request, and with Admiral Chester Nimitz's approval, transmitted a message stating that the island's saltwater distillation plant had broken down and that fresh water was urgently needed. It wasn't true. Midway's water systems were fine. But Japanese listening posts intercepted the message anyway, and within roughly 24 to 48 hours, Station Hypo picked up a new Japanese naval transmission, coded, reporting that AF was short on fresh water. There it was. Confirmed, not by a hunch, but by the Japanese Navy's own communications, unknowingly repeating a lie the Americans had planted for them to find. Rochefort's assessment had been correct. Washington's had been wrong. Nimitz, who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet only 5 months earlier, in the smoking ruin of Pearl Harbor's aftermath, made a decision that historians still describe as one of the most consequential command choices of the entire war. He chose to trust a code-breaking unit's fragmentary intelligence over the numerical reality on the surface. Japan's combined fleet, even after losses at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942, still vastly outnumbered what the United States could put to sea. Japan was preparing to send 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of supporting warships toward Midway. Nimitz had 3 carriers, one of them, the USS Yorktown, so badly damaged from Coral Sea that Navy engineers at Pearl Harbor estimated repairs would normally take about 3 months. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. Shipyard workers swarmed the Yorktown around the clock, welding over gashes in her hull and patching flight deck damage well enough to get her back to sea, not fully repaired, but functional. It was, by itself, one of the more remarkable industrial feats of the war, a direct answer to the exact strategic gap Yamamoto had privately calculated Japan could never close: America's capacity to absorb damage and keep producing. But the repaired carrier meant nothing without knowing where and when to send her. And this is where Rochefort's team delivered something even more specific than the location. By late May 1942, piecing together further intercepted traffic, Station Hype had assembled a detailed operational picture: the approximate date of the attack, the bearing the Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, would approach from, and even the approximate time the first air strikes against Midway's defenses would begin. A diversionary attack against the Aleutian Islands, intended to split American attention and forces, was also identified for what it was: a feint, not the main effort. On May 27, 1942, Japan changed its naval codebooks and additive tables, as it periodically did as a security precaution, and imposed radio silence across the fleet moving toward Midway. For American codebreakers, the window closed at almost the exact moment it was needed most. But it closed a few days too late. Nimitz already had what he needed: 3 American carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily patched Yorktown, moved quietly into position northeast of Midway, waiting in a spot Japanese reconnaissance never expected an American fleet to be, because Japanese commanders didn't know an American fleet had any reason to be there at all. On June 3, 1942, Japanese forces struck the Aleutians, exactly as Rochefort's team had predicted. The next morning, June 4, 1942, a real battle began, and Isoroku Yamamoto, the admiral who had privately warned his own government that Japan could not win a long war, was about to discover that the Americans hadn't just survived his opening blow at Pearl Harbor. They had spent the 6 months since reading his mail, June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m., approximately 150 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, in roughly 6 minutes. Dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown caught 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their flight decks packed full of fueled aircraft and armed bombs, mid-changeover between strike missions. All 3 carriers were left burning wrecks within that single narrow window. A 4th carrier, the Hiryu, launched a counterattack that critically damaged the Yorktown, but American dive bombers found and destroyed her later that same afternoon. By the time the Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942, Japan had lost all 4 fleet carriers it had committed to the operation, roughly 3, perhaps, sailors and airmen, and, perhaps most costly of all, a corps of veteran carrier pilots and deck crew that Japan's training pipeline could never fully replace. The United States lost the Yorktown and 1 destroyer, along with 307 personnel. It is still taught at the U.S. Naval War College and at Japan's own National Defense Academy as the single turning point of the Pacific War, 6 months and a day after Yamamoto's carriers struck Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's carriers were sunk in almost exactly the window he had privately told his own government he could run wild before Japan's odds began to collapse. What makes Midway remarkable isn't only the outcome, it's how completely Japan's naval command misunderstood why they'd lost. Japanese leadership largely attributed the defeat to bad luck, a stroke of unfortunate timing during that carrier changeover, rather than to the real cause, that the United States had known, in advance, almost exactly where they were going, when they'd arrive, and how they intended to attack. The Imperial Japanese Navy conducted an internal review afterward and, remarkably, did not conclude that its codes had been broken. JN-25 continued in modified use for the rest of the war, changing periodically as a routine precaution, but never fully abandoned as compromised. That failure to recognize the actual cause of Midway is, on its own, one of the more consequential intelligence blind spots of the entire war, and it meant Station Hypo's advantage didn't end with one battle. It paid off again, 10 months later, in a much more personal way for the man who'd started this story, on April 14, 1943, American Codebreakers, by now a more mature, better-resourced signals intelligence operation than the improvised basement unit of early 1942, intercepted and decrypted a detailed Japanese naval message. It laid out Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's exact itinerary for an inspection tour of forward Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands, including precise arrival times, aircraft types, and flight routes, down to the minute. Feist. The message traveled up the American chain of command to the White House. President Franklin Roosevelt personally authorized what would become one of the most controversial and consequential targeted operations of the war, Operation Vengeance, on the morning of April 18, 1943, a year to the month after the Doolittle raid Yamamoto had feared would embolden American resolve. 18 U.S. Army Air Force's P-38 Lightning fighters flew a nearly 600-mile route from Guadalcanal, timed with extraordinary precision to intercept Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville. At approximately 9:34 a.m., they found it exactly where the intercepted signal said it would be. Yamamoto's plane was shot down in the jungle. He did not survive. The Imperial Japanese Navy would spend the rest of the war never fully replacing the strategic mind that had, from the very beginning, warned them that this outcome was mathematically likely. Joseph Rochefort, the man whose basement team made Midway possible, was transferred out of Station Hypo within weeks of the battle, a casualty not of the enemy, but of inter-service rivalry in Washington, where officers resentful of his unconventional methods and his direct line to Nimitz maneuvered him into a less prominent posting. He was recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal by Nimitz himself in 1942. The recommendation was blocked. Rochefort did not receive that medal until 1985, presented posthumously to his family, 43 years after Midway, 9 years after his own death in 1976. For the Imperial Japanese fleet that struck Pearl Harbor was, in December 1941, arguably the most capable carrier force on Earth. It ruled the Pacific for exactly as long as Yamamoto privately predicted it could, and it lost its momentum, carriers, and eventually its architect, not primarily to American steel or American numbers, but to a small windowless room in Hawaii, where a team that never fired a shot read the enemy's plans before the enemy's own fleet did. If stories like this, The quiet, overlooked turning points hiding behind the famous battles are what you're here for. That's exactly the kind of history this channel is going to keep chasing down. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what gets researched next.